Welcome to Adding Value with Assar, the show where we dive into the stories, strategies, and market insights shaping the world of industrial and logistics real estate. In each episode, we sit down with industry leaders, investors, developers, and tenants to explore their journeys, unpack current market trends, and share takeaways that can help you better understand and navigate the business. You guys can work through this, right? Like you can
screw up all you want. You can screw up all you want. You're doing real well on this to start. So I see things being positive going in.
Well, it means good news for all of us.
I hope so.
Yeah.
If not, you can roll back the tape and yell.
Yeah, that's right.
I would say a common trait and something for young people or new people in the industry to think about for successful brokers is the ability to listen.
Value creation is not just about the numbers and the financial stuff. It's about creating value for our customer.
I remind myself, like, this is the business we got into. The business of what we got into.
Yeah.
The prerequisite was that you just don't give up.
We having the Kelsey brothers on next time?
Maybe. Who knows? Today, I'm honored to kick things off with a very special guest, the person who first brought me into the business and the CEO of our company, Voit Real Estate Services, Eric Hinkelman. He manages 6 offices across Southern California, guiding both brokers and clients through some of the most dynamic growth years our industry has seen. We'll hear about his journey, his perspective on the market today, and his vision for the future. Eric, thank you so much for joining us here today. Today's the first episode. A little bit of backstory. When this idea was kind of brewing for me to start this show, one of the questions I kept coming back to was, if I were to move forward, who would be my first guest? And, I shared with you a couple of weeks ago when we went to lunch that in many ways, I feel like you've been similar to like a father figure to me in the business. And so I told myself, you know what, if I pitch this idea to Eric, and not only is he supportive, but also he agrees to be my first guest, then this thing's 100% go. So thank you so much for coming today. For those who may not know you, if you just be kind enough to share a little bit about your background, how you got into the business, and what your role is as CEO of Voit Real Estate Services.
Sure, happy to. Before I chime in on that, God, I am old enough to be your father, aren't I? That's crazy. I feel like I've been in this business forever, and it is going on just over 40 years. I started, like so many people, as a broker. I worked for one of the big national companies, and I spent 8 years there. I was peddling office space. Back then, in the mid-counties market, that was okay. It was not as fun, I would say, as the industrial brokers or the retail brokers, but nonetheless, that's kind of where I cut my teeth. I spent 8 years at CBRE, but back then it was called Coldwell Banker, if you want to try and figure out how old I am. And from there, I took a job at Trammell, and I spent 16 years at Trammell. I came in, I was an office broker. I also handled some retail, the Citadel factory stores, etc. And the last couple of years, I was approached and asked to go into management and take over the brokerage for Southern California at Trammell. So that was my first, jump in the big waters as far as management was concerned. And we did that up until the company was purchased in 2005, I believe. And at that point, I was weighing my options, et cetera, and I was in management. So I ended up taking a job at Cushman and Wakefield, and I spent 8 years there. My last couple of years, Shai, I was responsible for the Western United States for investor services.
Wow.
And that entailed a fair amount of travel. I thought it would be glamorous and a lot of fun. As it turned out, it was difficult, and all that travel was tough. I was missing some of my son's baseball games, and if somebody sneezes on an airplane 2 days later, I was getting a cold.
Bummer.
So after a couple of years, I decided to move on from that, and that's when Bob Voit, the founder of Voit Real Estate, asked me to come over and run the brokerage for a few of the offices. And I made the move roughly 11 years ago. And it was a fantastic move, and I couldn't be happier. It's a great environment, a great platform. And I'm happy that I'm not traveling the way I was.
Sure.
And I'm thrilled with the people that we all get to work with on a day in, day out basis.
I've always wondered when it comes to, for example, when you transition into management, how did that look like? I mean, did I guess the management at the time see something in you that they felt like you could be a great manager for the company? I'm waiting for
That's a great question, and I don't know how they would have thought that with me. It's interesting. I think when you're a salesperson, you're meant to be a salesperson, and I'd like to think that I was a salesperson. So I will tell you, when I first got into management, it was difficult. They were smart in that they let me transition, and they gave me a fair amount of time to transition out of the brokerage. So I kind of was wearing two hats at one time for a while. But it was tough. If you're a salesperson, you're your own boss.
Sure.
And you set your day, and you're really only accountable to yourself and your family, et cetera. And when you go into management, you're accountable to everyone. And it was a big change. And it took a little bit of time for me to really grasp that and frankly, how to behave. But after a while, I started getting the swing of things. And so far, so good.
Wow. When I started, I remember when I started with Voit, I was right out of business school. It was 2014. It was right after you had, we pretty much joined at the same time. And
I think you were my very first hire.
That's right.
Yeah.
I was the first hire. And thank you, by the way. So great experience for me. Yeah. So I remember when I had started early in the company, I started in 2014. We had relatively started around the same time. And the company was going through a transition. And I was kind of too young in the business to know what was going on. But I remember there was a little bit of volatility there. And, at the time, the brokers or the senior brokers, some of the senior brokers had approached Bob Voit, who was the owner of the company, and kind of facilitated a transfer or sale to the brokers. And you were, if I remember correctly, at the helm of that, and you were involved in that. What can you share about that experience? What was that like? How did that deal all come together? And really, what does it mean for this next generation of brokers that are here at Voit?
Yeah, that's a lot in one question. So you're right. It was a total transitional period. Bob Voit, the original founder of Voit, he was a developer and an investor, and brokerage came after, frankly, that whole development and investment platform, if you will. And after a while, Bob just did not love the operational side of things, rendering 30, 40, 50 decisions a day, et cetera. He wanted to go out and figure out his next development or investment opportunity. He wanted out of the day-to-day management, if you will. And so the thought was perhaps we sell the company, or he sells the company to one of our friendly competitors, or somebody or a company entity that would be accretive to what we do. And he did have a meeting with a number of our senior brokers, and out of that meeting, I was not a part of it, but out of that meeting, the decision was rendered that the best course of action was for him to sell the company internally to Voit, to the brokers. And that took, 7 or 8 months. It was a while. He had picked 3 senior brokers to negotiate with, and they were able to ultimately hammer through that. And yeah, there was a lot of unknowns there. I think the day-to-day business was still doing fine, dandy. The brokers, they're independent. They're out there doing their thing. And so I think most of the brokers had their heads down and were just focusing on making money and trying to service their clients, et cetera. But that transition took a while. And then ultimately, they struck a deal to sell the company internally to the Voit people. We had every intention of keeping the Voit name, and more importantly, the Voit culture, which is just so important to all of us, as you guys well know.
Sure.
And it ended up working out swimmingly. And I think it worked out really well for Bob, as well as Voit. The name is here. The culture is here. It's stuff that he established. It's something that he can put his head down at night and feel good about. And at the same time, he was able to get out of that day-to-day operations and do what he loves, which is investing and or developing. And it worked out great for us in that we had the autonomy to take it wherever we wanted to take it.
And then that creates kind of a unique, not just culture, but kind of a unique value proposition for brokers, right? Because certain brokers after a certain amount of tenure and production at the company, they become shareholders and they have an invested interest and they receive dividends and things of that nature, which is honestly been great. You kind of you manage 6 different offices, 1 in LA, 2 in Orange County, 2 in San Diego, and 1 in the Inland Empire. and you see every listing agreement that gets signed, every commission agreement that gets signed. Just curious, what have you been seeing to date, between the different offices? Any specific trends, anything interesting that you might share that, might be?
Yeah, I'm happy to. As you know, we've got a manager down in San Diego who takes care of our La Jolla office, and we've got a smaller office in Encinitas also, Eric Northbrook.
Sure.
But I do oversee the other offices as well as the company, so I do get to see quite a bit. I would say I am signing more listing agreements than I have in the past, and you might think that it's all sublease listings. It's people that are in trouble. They need to throw their space on the market or get rid of half of it, et cetera. And that kind of was the case. I signed a lot of listings in 2024, but I would tell you in 25, maybe 10, 15, 20% max are sublease listings. The rest of it is direct listings. As to your other part of the question, if I'm seeing different trends of types of industries, et cetera, it really just depends on the market. The market that you and Braden work out in the Inland Empire, I think that's driven differently than, say, the LA market, which is so focused on the port and port driven. And then in Orange County, you're not as port driven as say the LA market there, certainly LA South Bay or mid counties, but it's the smaller manufacturers, and those folks are still doing things. In fact, some of the smaller manufacturing companies are taking on more space. Some of them obviously are contracting and selling their buildings or leasing or subleasing their buildings. But in Orange County, it seems like it's more of the smaller manufacturers. Out in your market, obviously, you build big bombers, and so it's those logistics companies and the logistics business, and you can answer this probably better than me. It seems like that's certainly cool, a lot of which is related to some of the big retailers that have gone out of business. And so the logistics companies now are sitting there with big piles of space, et cetera, that has gotten thrown on the market. And you combine that with the fact that in 21 and 22, the market was so white hot, and people were out there buying land, and almost didn't matter what the cost was, and then going and trying to get it entitled and built and so forth. So there was a flood of product that was thrown on the market, and all that combination, if you will, has created some vacancy and probably some unrest, if you will, out in your market.
Yep. I it's interesting you say that, because I have talked to a couple different investors, and there has been obviously some cooling and interest on buying certain products in the Inland Empire, but these same individual investors are pretty bullish in Orange County. Maybe not necessarily in above 100,000 square foot spaces, but just because they feel like there's still a robust tenant pool in Orange County. To your earlier point, there's a lot of diversity there, and they're not necessarily distribution related companies. So how does as far as activity that you've been seeing at the company, how does the level of production you've seen from brokers? Because we had, say, 3 years or 4 years as the market was peaking, where the numbers were, everybody was doing huge deals and a high velocity of deals. Taking those years aside, how does our production level compare historically?
Yeah, it's a good question. So if you take 2021 and 22 out of the equation, right? Those were the years that industrial just was crazy. And so if you take that out of the equation, and as you well know, Voit is so heavily industrial. Of our 135 brokers, over 100 of our brokers are industrial, right?
Sure.
So if you take that out of the equation, a couple of data points for you. One, year to date in 2025, we're 15% ahead of year to date in 24.
Wow.
And 24 wasn't a bad year. If you look back over the dozen years that I've been around here, 25 so far, and if I had it wood, I'd knock on it. I guess we'll go here. But 25 is shaping up to be a really solid year. I thought that we were living off of the big deal, right? The major deals with huge commissions attached to it, but the volume was maybe a little more hollow, and I couldn't have been more wrong. The stats actually were almost 12% higher in deal volume.
Wow.
On top of 15% higher year to date in revenue. So
It's almost parallel.
Yeah, things are really kind of clicking along. And it was surprising to me. I felt like I was signing off on more transactions last year, but that's not the case. I've signed off on many more this year to date, and I hope that the last quarter stays in line with what the first 3 quarters have looked like.
And is there a specific office or a specific region that maybe is having more velocity relative to others? And how is that production shaking up that way?
Okay. In answer to that, I would say, your office out in the Inland Empire, you guys, it was a tougher year in 24 for a host of reasons, right? But your office seems like it's turned the corner, and 25 is shaping up to be a really decent year, if not a great year, for the Inland Empire, which I think would probably come as a bit of a surprise for most of your listeners. Sure. Orange County has just kind of been consistent, but this year the difference is we have gotten some bigger deals, and investment has picked up. I don't know the exact percentage, but investments as a general topic, if you will, has picked up, and we've been reaping the benefits in large part in Orange County. And as you well know, we've got a number of brokers and a lot of guys that have been doing it and gals that have been doing it for 40 years that have long established relationships, et cetera. And a lot of those are coming to fruition. At least they have so far in 25.
Sure. I think just to speak to the Inland Empire, one of the reasons, at least I look at why production may have been down in 24 relative to 25 is there was a period of time after the market had peaked because so many investors and developers had bought buildings or built buildings at high valuations that there was almost a resistance to reduce their pricing. And this had created a delay or stagnation in transaction volume, especially in 23. And then slowly, I feel like the market started to adjust in 24, where we saw a little bit of pickup in velocity. But that motivation, I'd say, from both landlords and sellers, that motivation grew throughout 24 and really bled into 25, allowing rates to kind of come into a space where if there is an active requirement in the market, then a tenant now can actually pay the price. And so I think some of that production and the fact that our production is higher in the IE than it was last year may not necessarily be because the market's in a better place. It's just that we're having more velocity. People are actually willing, there's more motivation to do deals.
Yeah. So in thinking about what you just said, which I agree with, I think a part of that is the IE is so institutionally owned. I mean, let's face it, every major industrial institution is in the IE, probably in the IE in a big way, or wants to be.
Sure.
And if you think about how those companies, their individuals, their acquisition people, their asset management people, their market rep people, et cetera, how they get compensated, if you're an institution and you came in and you spent $80 a foot on land, and then you spent a year getting entitlements and figuring out what to build and then building it, and construction costs, by the way, have not gone down, you've got some pretty high thresholds that you need to meet. And bonuses, et cetera, are probably predicated off of the success of the different projects.
Sure.
And so I could see how the institutions would be holding out until the very, very end, because perhaps some of their individuals, their bonuses, their comp, their livelihood is tied into that. So I totally agree with what you're saying. I think part of that, though, is there was probably a bigger resistance by the institutions since maybe some of the family-owned types of real estate that realize that the market is changing and they'll make a change on a moment's notice, as opposed to a 3 or a 4 month process of trying to get approvals to drop our pro forma down to X.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting when because we have clients both on the institutional side and the private owner side. And for the longest period of time, I'd say it was probably, from a broker's perspective, more beneficial to have the institutional client, and I'm sure it still is, but when the market was hot, just because the transactions were so seamless, if you had a listing for lease, for example, and as this shift was happening, I noticed that the private clients that you have, because they may not necessarily be beholden to promote or their payment structure, their number one focus is, I just want a good tenant in my building. Right? If the market is, for argument's sake, $150 a foot, I'll take $1.30 and put somebody in there who's going to be a good quality tenant. It's almost easier in that market to do a deal with those folks than it may be sometimes in a scenario in which you have to hit a certain number. What are your thoughts as far as kind of, now that the company has become strictly brokerage related services, what do you envision for the next 3 to 5 years, or coming out of where we are in the cycle and the growth of the company?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a hard one to answer. I unfortunately don't truly have a crystal ball. I would say that we are certainly a niche company, being predominantly industrial brokers, being really focused in Southern California from San Diego up through Orange County, Inland Empire into parts of LA. We are, for lack of a better term, a wanted commodity. And so many, I should say, of the major players have approached and to look and find out if there is an interest in potentially merging or selling, et cetera. And we've been resistant because we really have a great thing going. We do have a niche business. We don't have any outside influences. So if we want to render a decision, it's pretty quick and we can do it. We're not beholden to outside shareholders. We're not one of those companies that needs to have quarter over quarter growth, et cetera. We're realists when it comes to that. And we have this unique culture. I mean, who spends the kind of money that we spend on our incentive trips and our summer parties and all of our different socials and so forth? And that was something that Bob Voit created years ago, and that's part of the culture that we will maintain as long as possible. So in a long roundabout way of answering your question, I think we'll continue to grow organically. I don't see us making any big acquisitions. We might make some smaller types of acquisitions. I don't necessarily see us merging with one of our, friendly major league competitors or international players. It's really not who we are, if you will.
Sure.
And we've got a really good thing, and I certainly don't want to break it.
Yeah, and it's the word culture. It's interesting because I remember back when I was in school and we'd have these business classes, the word culture got thrown around a lot, and this was before I had real life experience, right? And I just thought it was this fuzzy thing that was a good answer to every, business case question. And, I got to be honest, ever since I've been at Voit, it's all I've ever known. Having said that, every time I've considered, what would it be like to be at a different firm, I always came back to the fact that the company's been great. I enjoy the people that I work with. And it came back to that word, the culture. It really is real value in the culture that's been established at our company. And I think sometimes about young guys, a guy like Braden, who recently got started with us, that it'd be a good place for him to grow and so forth. I mean, Braden, what questions do you have for Eric now that you've been with the company for, 6 months now?
Yeah, just about 6 months. And really, for other young guys that are out there too, the curiosity is, all the big names, the JLLs, the CBREs, the Colliers, some of the smaller firms such as ourselves, the Lees, the Doms. You talked about that niche and our focus here in Southern California. What sort of is that cultural difference that Voit does have that other firms may not? And for a young guy looking at potentially maybe being on the principal side, or maybe being on asset management or in property management, or there's so many different facets of the real estate world. What is maybe that young guy out there that you would answer to him that is thinking, hey, what is brokerage like? And if I were at Voit, what would that be like for me?
Yeah, Braden, I think you threw a couple of questions in there, so I'll give it a try. What kind of sets us apart from, say, the major players? One, we're privately held, right? Mm-hmm. So Shai obviously is a principal in the company. At some of our friendly competitors, one, they view the people sitting next to them potentially as competition, right? If you don't get the deal, somebody else is going to get it, et cetera. At our firm, if Shai doesn't get the deal, but the guy sitting 20 feet away from him gets the deal, Shai's happy because at the end of the year, profits dividend, Shai's going to make some money from that. So we actually are legitimately rowing in the same direction. So that's one of the big differences too. And Shai, you alluded to it earlier. We had property management, we had project management, et cetera. We purged that because we really wanted to truly be a great regional Southern California based brokerage company. And so we got rid of all those other services and have just really honed and focused on being a brokerage company. And that seems to have worked out really well for us too. As for your question about young people, it's a tough one. I think commercial real estate brokerage is something that so many young people want to do when they get out of school, especially if they don't know exactly what they want to do, if they're not going to go to grad school or law school or whatever the case may be. I think the individual that's got a fire in their belly and they're driven to succeed, because let's face it, you guys are self-starters. You're all independent contractors. I'm not going to look over, Shai's, shoulder every single day. I might look over yours when you're first getting started, et cetera, just to make sure that you're not going down the wrong bunny trail, et cetera. But you guys are self-starters. So we look for people that are driven, that are focused. We like athletes in our industry because for the most part, athletes get up in the morning and they work their tails off to become the best at whatever it is they're doing. And it's no different in sales. Our brokerage, I think we're somewhat unique in that not only do you have the benefit of training under, Shai and being able to draft off of everything he does, but we bring in outside services, as you well know, on a weekly basis for that supplemental training and the additional arrow in your proverbial quiver, for lack of a better cliche. So we try and prepare our young people so much more so, I think, than a lot of our competition who say, there's an empty desk, here's a phone, here's some business cards, go make it happen. I think that's kind of a recipe for disaster, and the turnover is so high in those types of operations and shops, and that's just not who we are. We're going to try and provide as many resources for a young person or a new person coming into the industry to ensure that they have every opportunity to be successful.
Truly.
And does that actually answer your question?
It does. And to add on to that as well, the investment that Voit makes in a younger person such as myself who knows other young individuals at competing firms and asking questions, we have all the resources. And on Tuesdays, we get to train with Russ Johnson, which is incredible that there's specific time carved out for us to dig into a lease, for us to dig into a PSA, a purchase and sale agreement, and actually get a hands-on training, almost being like still in a university or a school of some sorts where you're digging into the commercial real estate aspect of brokerage and actually gaining a lot of value from that, so that when you go out there into the streets and you're talking to different potential clients, you can actually provide that value and that service that they're looking for off the bat in a young guy, and not just be some other young guy who might not have as much experience and
or that training where they ask you a question and you're like a deer in headlights.
Definitely.
How do I answer this? So we do our best to really provide as big a foundation of training as we can for our young people. It's not an easy business. Otherwise, everybody'd be in it.
Sure.
It's not an easy business. But for those it's meant to be, the world is your upside. And as long as we can provide you guys and gals with all of the necessary training and resources, we feel like we've done our job.
Definitely.
So.
Yeah, just to kind of add on what you said earlier about culture is like, of course, we're all competitors, right? But the one thing I have noticed about Voit is that I never really feel like there's contentious competition. To your point earlier about other brokers in the office doing deals and necessarily us being upset about it, because at least what I experienced in Ontario, we kind of have a generation of guys who are right around my age, about 40, and then we have a generation of younger guys that are about Braden's age, and it's created a little bit of a community out there where we're kind of all friends. And so that market is so big that we're all in the thick of our career looking to grow market share in the business. And we find that working together ends up being a better solution than competing with each other. So to your point that, so-and-so does a deal in the office, so-and-so does a deal in the office. Yes, there's those financial benefits for the company, but at the same time, it's a huge win for us collectively. That's something that I can say has been very valuable in my experience at the company as well.
And I do think that is something that not every company could claim. I think it is somewhat unique to us in that, like I said earlier, we are all rowing in the same direction and we're all rooting for each other. Obviously, individually, we're competitive. We
Sure.
want to win. We want to make a ton of money, but we want all of the people sitting around us to make a ton of dough.
Yeah. So you've been in the business, you've been in management for a very long time. You've
Yes.
seen junior brokers.
As long as Braden's been on this planet.
Yeah. How old are you, Braden?
25.
25. 25 years in management. You've kind of seen it all different tiers. You've seen young guys, you've seen, mid-tier guys as they call them, and you've seen seasoned brokers, veterans. What would you say are some common traits a successful broker has?
When I first got into the business, Shai, and I was training under a guy who was a very philosophical individual, so I loved listening to him. He would say stuff that I would never even think of. But one of the things he said to me early on was, when you're a newbie, a new person into the industry, and obviously you don't have this 5-page resume of massive deals and gray hair around your temples, etc., you have a tendency to try and overcompensate for that by being the smartest in the room and talking. And all you're doing is talking about yourself or what you know, and you're never spending the time to sit and listen to what your client has to say and where is your client's pain point, what's important to your client, and inevitably you miss the boat and you don't get the business or you screw it up somehow. So I would say a common trait and something for young people or new people in the industry to think about for successful brokers is the ability to listen.
Mm-hmm.
It's great to show off everything you know and the deals you did here, there, and everywhere else and the trends in the market. But if you can't sit and listen to what your client has to say and what's important to them, where their pain is, you're not going to be able to fulfill their actual needs. And ultimately, you may or may not be able to, get a transaction done. And you certainly don't have a long-term client. And let's face it, in this business, building our resume and building our clients is everything.
Sure.
It makes things so much easier and smoother. And you're not having to pitch your wares every single day as you mature in the business. So the ability to listen, I think, is something that so many people miss. The other thing, and we mentioned it, is you've got to get up in the morning and be excited to go in, not dread going in. And you've got to have that passion, the fire in your belly, that the drive to succeed and to be able to provide a great service for your client or your prospect. And so that's not something we can teach. Passion is part of your DNA, or it's not necessarily. And it doesn't mean you can't be successful in our business, but if you're looking for common traits, that's one where you find those individuals that are just focused and they're passionate and they're driven and they love what they do.
Yeah.
It's infectious.
It's so interesting because I agree 100%. I actually have a lot of fun in the business, no matter how hard we work. It's just, there's something about a combination of two things: growing and the thrill of the deal, right? You're always chasing the deal. There's so many different ways when you're working on an assignment that the deal can essentially fall through the cracks and not make. And so the excitement and the adrenaline that it brings in the pursuit of making a deal is kind of what gets me going in the morning. Now it's funny because by the time the deal is actually done, that euphoric state is gone. So you're always pursuing the next deal. What would you say are some of the maybe most common? I mean, we see young guys come into the business, and after a few years, for one reason or another, they may not necessarily make it. what would you say for the guys that may not necessarily make it in the business? What are some common mistakes or what the reasons may be behind it?
Yeah, I think it's a myriad of reasons. One of the ones that I see, though, on a fairly regular basis is you're relatively new into the business, and maybe in your first year or your second year or early into your third year, you get a couple of really big transactions and you get them done and you make a pile of money. And whether it's consciously or subconsciously, you might think, I've got this business mastered. And you take your foot off the gas pedal. Mm-hmm. And if you do that, there's others that are obviously going to be flying right past you. And the next thing you know, your pipeline is relatively dry. And you realize you're starting all over from scratch, if you will. Whereas if you had gotten those couple of big deals done and you kept going and, was making hay and getting out there and working, that would have just continued to build upon itself.
Sure.
So one of the mistakes I see is, somebody will come in to the business and they'll make a couple of really big deals and they decide to go buy a boat. And their, Fridays became optional when it comes to working, and Mondays don't start until noon or whatever, and you're losing ground. And frankly, you're losing, what positive mojo you had going.
Sure.
So I think that's probably the biggest thing I see, and I get it. I mean, gosh, you made a bunch of money, go on a trip and go buy a car, go buy a house, whatever. But don't take your foot off the pedal.
Right.
There was a senior guy way back in the day, and he had made a comment to me, and it still sticks with me 40-something years later. He said, every time I go off and I make a big transaction, the first thing I do is go out cold calling. And I was like, really? Why? And he's like, well, one, I'm never going to be in a better mood than I am now because I just got a big deal done. And two, if I get kicked out of an office or somebody tells me to bug off or whatever, I don't care. I just, got a big deal done and I'm in great spirits. And by the way, there's something to it when you're really positive, happy, friendly, easy to chit chat with. And let's face it, you're at your best when you're in the best possible mood. You get a deal done. And business came. And so that one always stuck with me is, go out cold calling after you get a huge deal done.
Yeah.
You're never going to be in a better mood. And by the way, if things don't go right, who cares?
Yeah, you just got a big deal done.
Yeah. Who cares?
Yeah. I look at our business and I look at guys like, for example, get started, and I look at my own career. There's a learning curve, obviously, to learn the business. There's the prerequisites of success certainly apply here, right? So showing up early, working hard, all those things, those are non-negotiable. The challenges in our business sometimes for a young guy, I feel like, is there's a learning curve in the business and our transaction cycles are long. By the time you establish a relationship and that relationship comes up as a potential opportunity, and then you get chosen to work with the client, and then the deal cycle in itself is incredibly long. So there's a lot of room for error almost, right? And for guys to get weeded out the business. So it's incredibly important that one, the person be the right person, right? They recognize this, they have perseverance, and at the same time, it feels like as a young guy, it's so important who you kind of align yourself with.
Absolutely.
Because if your senior broker is kind of all over the place and not really able to give you the mentorship for years, like this is not a 1-year project, this is a 2, 3, 4-year project, it can have a huge impact on what your career looks like. And I feel very fortunate here that like at a company like Voit, we've had so many good senior brokers. I've always felt like I've sought for mentorship from guys like Mike Hefner in the company, guys like yourself, even Juan when I was out of Ontario, when I was kind of on my own and I was looking to someone to kind of show me the ropes. Everybody's kind of lent a hand to kind of guide me through the next. And I felt like the best way to always reciprocate as a young guy to an older guy or a more senior guy has been when they train you, when they show you the ropes, if you can find a way to give back in the form of business. You dig something up and you bring it back to them and you work with them. That's the best way to pay it back.
Yeah, and to dovetail on that, when you're relatively new in the business, there's a lot you don't know still. And if you do stumble into an opportunity, et cetera, bringing someone in that's got seasoning, that knows the market inside and out, knows the industry that you're dealing with, knows the landlords that are the logical buildings to go into, et cetera. Bringing somebody like that in, doesn't it kind of assure you of a potential success?
For sure.
You mentioned earlier there are things that are completely out of your abilities, if not abilities, but anything you can do about it, et cetera. And so those types of things happen, right? It's completely out of your control. Figured that one out. But frankly, bringing somebody in, especially when you're relatively new to the business, it gives you peace of mind. And by the way, they'll remember that. Senior broker remembers that, and it'll maybe open up opportunities for additional business. But more importantly, it raises your probability of getting the transaction done. If it becomes complex, complicated, there's issues out there, the likelihood is that senior broker that may have been around for 20 or 30 years or whatever has been through it a half a dozen times, whereas you probably hadn't because you're new into the industry. And you might stumble, and ultimately then a transaction that could have taken place and made everybody happy doesn't take place.
Yeah. I remember it took me a while, because when I had gone off on my own, it took me a while to get comfortable with the idea to bring in somebody else in on the transaction. And once I started to get comfortable with the concept, I find myself now, even today, though I may not necessarily need the support on certain transactions, that I prefer to align myself, kind of have strategic alliances in the office, depending on the profile of the transaction, to align myself with specific brokers. Because to your earlier point, though I can probably do everything soup to nuts, first of all, it's a great way to leverage your time. Right? If you have inbound business, there's only so much business you can work on. And at the same time, you want to deliver a good service to your client, right? You don't want, just because you're too busy, that for some reason your client's not getting the phone call back and so forth. So bringing in other people helps in that regard. But then in addition to that, we have guys in our office, everybody kind of specializes in something different. One guy his bread and butter is tenant representation assignments and buyer representation assignments. Another guy may be land for development. Another gentleman might be for investment sales. And so you, as someone who is generating business, you're getting a variety of different transaction types, and the flexibility at Voit, where we can just kind of go tap on someone's shoulder and say, this fits right into your bucket and profile. Let's work on this together. Not only has it become better for you as a broker, but to your early point, it allows you to continue to expand your relationships, right, and it parlays into more business.
Right. And you hit a really good point, which is leveraging your time also. I mean, all you two have in this business is what you know and your time. And if you're out trying to work on something outside of your expertise, you're learning a market, you're trying to understand the dynamics of it, the trends, et cetera, you're spending so much time where you could be focusing that attention on other things that are more direct and more, inside your space of comfort and where you guys are experts. So bringing somebody in who is, one, going to potentially being a much higher probability of getting a transaction done, but two, not just sucking up all of your time, because that's all you really have in this business is your time. I think it makes all the sense in the world. Am I going to tell somebody you're crazy? Why are you doing this? Why are you parachuting into a market, et cetera, that you don't know? Maybe I will, but they'll figure it out on their own.
They have to figure out the hard way.
Yeah,
that's
and
the thing.
Sometimes that's the best way.
Yeah.
So.
In regards to what's, potentially on the radar for 2026, when you talk to the brokers across the office, I mean, how do they feel, right? Specific markets, I mean, where do they kind of feel like the next year is going to be leading to?
So almost across the board, our brokers feel like 26 is going to be a little bit better than 25. Great. And like I'd mentioned earlier, 25 is shaping up to be a really good year for us. So I'm cautiously optimistic. But big picture, our brokers seem to feel more comfortable. And I sat in on the Alan Matkins forecast. It was a 4-hour undertaking with, a dozen different panels. And across the board, it seemed like most of the developers and investors, lenders, brokers, investment sale, capital markets people, they all felt like, we kind of bottomed out, if you will, sometime in 24. 25 has become much better, and 26 should be even more better. So it's not just our brokers, Shai, that are feeling a little more comfortable and confident about 26. It's across our industry as a whole, at least the subset that was part of that Alan Matkins forecast. And I've read up on other economists and forecasters, if you will, and they all seem to be much
Pretty
more
optimistic.
bullish. Yeah, I mean, who knows? I mean, gosh, there's so many geopolitical things that are out there that could obviously, U-turn things. But shy of something drastic happening, I feel like 26 is probably going to be even better than 25.
Great. Well, we're going to have to show up to work bright and early every day then.
Let's hope you guys do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again for coming. Been a real pleasure, and thank you again.
My pleasure.
All right. Thank you for listening to Adding Value with Shai Assar. We'll continue bringing on guests with stories and insights that matter in the world of industrial real estate. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it with a friend or colleague. And if you're a landlord, tenant, or investor exploring opportunities in the Inland Empire, feel free to reach out to us. We'd be happy to help you navigate the market.